From the Oklahoma newsroom, it's time for the Red Zone, our weekly extended look at Oklahoma football. Once again, it's time to get going. Ryan Aber, OU beat writer, in the studio with me to talk about training camp, how things are going for the Sooners as we hurtle towards that opener here, 2-ish weeks away for the Sooners. But Ryan, let's start with the thing that everybody wants to know, and that's where
we're talking about the centers, right?
Yeah, who's going to start at center? Maybe the guy that'll start right behind the starting center. That's the question of the day. Who is the starting quarterback going to be? When are we going to know? What's the situation right now with all that?
Well, Lincoln Riley said on Monday that he had an idea of the timeline that he wanted to follow. But one, he didn't want to tell us just because he didn't want us to know at this point. But two, he didn't want to tell us or make it public because he didn't want to marry himself to the timeline. But judging from the rest of what he said that Saturday Oklahoma's going to scrimmage for the second time. They held their first scrimmage on Monday, over the weekend, excuse me.
Yeah.
And it was Monday. The change in practice schedule messed me up a little bit.
It's throwing me off too, Ryan.
They scrimmaged Monday. Lincoln Riley said on Wednesday that he would use Saturday's scrimmage. I think those are the days I've got right there finally. He would use Saturday's scrimmage, and after that he would take stock of things and decide, are we ready to name a starter? Do we want to go ahead and do it? Do we need to extend this thing another few days? It's not going to be much longer after that. Lincoln Riley did say he wants to name a starter. He wants the team to know, and he wants the public to know, because he says at a program like OU, you're not going to be able to keep it under wraps pretty quickly into next week. So he didn't give us an exact timeline, but he sent a lot of indications over when he wants to make that decision.
So this isn't a situation where we're going to get to that opener against Florida Atlantic and it's going to be, surprise, it's whoever. It doesn't seem like that's the situation, right?
No, not at all. And Lincoln Riley addressed this exactly. He was asked about, well, is there an advantage to keeping it from the public, keeping it from us, keeping it from the team until right when you go to kickoff? He said, well, there are some advantages to that, but the disadvantages of it are your team doesn't know who their quarterback's going to be. They can't rally behind that guy. Quarterback is such an important figure on a football team that he wanted to have that guy in place heading into that game and pretty well before that game. So this isn't going to be a thing where he's going to wait until the quarterback runs out there to make it official. He wants to do that before. We saw how he handled it 3 years ago when Baker Mayfield beat out Trevor Knight and Cody Thomas. Cody Thomas sort of becomes the forgotten guy in that group, that he was in that competition, but that he named it 2 weeks before the opener, about 10 days or 11 days before the opener.
Yeah.
It was that Monday, the week before practice or game week. So that would be next Monday when they would name it, which seems to line up pretty closely with what he's thinking.
Is there a sense anybody showing any cards in their hand at this point as to which way things are leaning? Obviously, all the talk in the summer after Kyler Murray gets drafted is that you don't do those sorts of deals with the Oakland Athletics if this is not almost assured that he is going to be the starter. But do we sense any reading of the tea leaves in all this at this point?
Well, Lincoln Riley's been very careful not to give any indications over who the guy's going to be, although I don't see anything changing as far as what we thought going into preseason camp, which was that we felt like Kyler Murray was the guy, and I think Austin Kendall would have to just really be far and away Kyler Murray in order to make that decision. Although there's also an argument the other way, that if it's close, maybe you keep Austin Kendall the guy because you're going to have him next year, and you don't know you're going to have Kyler Murray. As much as Lincoln Riley wants to say that, Kyler Murray's going to be off playing baseball this year. It's just untenable that it would be any other direction because of what his contract calls for and the amount required of, one, a starting quarterback, and two, a professional baseball player who's trying to rise up through the system quickly. So it's just an impossibility to think about that. But I don't think there's been any indication that there's any different feeling as to what we had going into preseason camp.
I know, as you said, there's another scrimmage coming up this weekend, and very much follows in line with what we saw the last time Oklahoma had a quarterback decision to make. But at the same time, Lincoln Riley has to balance this out and manage this in a way to keep these guys on his roster. School's getting ready to start. getting a guy to stay until that point, get him going into class. I would think there's an advantage program-wide to make sure you've got that quarterback depth there. Is that part of the equation too, Ryan?
Well, I mean, he won't come out and say that, obviously, but certainly it is that you want Austin Kendall to go to a class on Monday and be, have that count for a year for him. Because say if Austin Kendall loses out on the job and he wants to go transfer somewhere else, yes, he'd have to sit out this year, but if he goes to a class and that changes his clock even further back. So you want that to happen. Same thing with Kyler Murray, although Kyler Murray has a little bit more flexibility to just say, forget about it.
Yeah.
I'm going to go down to Arizona and start working with the Oakland A's. But certainly there's an advantage there, especially when you look at their quarterback depth. They've got Tanner Schaefer, a walk-on, who's right now their third-string quarterback. You figure that Tanner Mordecai, the very talented quarterback from Waco, would be really number 3 in actuality if it came to that. Obviously, OU coaches really hope it doesn't come to that. They want a redshirt Tanner Mordecai. But at the same time, really you've got 2 quarterbacks with experience and then nothing really behind them.
Yeah, definitely the transfer situation's got to be something that Lincoln Riley's thinking about. Okay, we've broken down the quarterback battle as much as we can, which is unknown to this point. And I know that we've seen a limited amount of actual practice. But Ryan, as you've heard and talked to people down at OU, is there a player or a position group that you feel like has been most impressive as this camp has gone on this month?
Well, a lot of the talk has been on the defensive line and guys like Neville Gallimore, who's shown all kinds of talent. I wrote about this in the Oklahoman for Thursday's paper. Shown all kinds of talent, just hasn't quite translated into what's going on with him on Saturdays. They feel really good about Amani Bledsoe on the defensive line. A guy that I think is primed for a really big season is Kenneth Mann, who didn't get talked about much last year, but this is a guy who had 5 sacks playing behind DJ Ward. He really had a strong finish to last year. He's a little bit undersized on that end, but they really feel good about him and what he's got an opportunity to bring to this defense as they look to try to do some different things given some guys that they lost.
Do they feel like they have, or do you feel like they have a starting rotation figured out yet on that defensive line?
I think they feel pretty close to good. I think the question is Gallimore going to start over Marquise Overton? Last year, Overton overtook him. Overton's not really a flashy guy, but he's a guy who just sort of quietly goes about his business and gets things done. Gallimore is a guy who can be really disruptive if he's running on all cylinders. Wasn't doing that much last year. He's been a little bit banged up in preseason camp. That's a bit concerning, but I think they would prefer to have Gallimore there, all things considered. It's really going to be interesting to see what they do at that outside rush spot, the jack, which is mainly a linebacker spot that Obo Okoronkwo played a year ago. They've got some names in there in the mix, including Addison Gums, that they really like. But they're starting to get closer to what they'd like their rotation to be. But they do feel like they're going to have some depth that they haven't had in quite a few years. And I think that speaks to, one, the recruiting that they've done the last few years with, even really started under Jerry Montgomery, that their recruiting took off a little bit. It's really hard in this league to recruit on the defensive line. But Calvin Thibodeau, I thought, has done a really good job recently with that, and just the continuity of Thibodeau. Now he's entering his 3rd year. He's entering their 2nd year with Ruffin McNeil being a part of that group, and that's really helped these guys find some footing that they've really been lacking the last few years.
Hard to recruit to that position, but also hard to play in this league if you don't have some depth on that defensive line. So definitely an interesting group to watch. Ryan, as this camp's gone on, is there a guy that you feel like is most under the radar, maybe we're not really talking about, but is either having a great camp or is going to have a big impact this season?
Initially I was going to say Kenneth Mann, but just talked about him a little bit more. So I'm going to stick with the defensive side of the ball and say Justin Broyles, a guy that I don't want to say we forgot about, but was such a big-time recruit coming out of Oklahoma City a year ago, wound up redshirting. Some other guys played in front of him. Robert Barnes played in front of him at the safety spot, and you wondered just how much this guy was going to be able to compete this year for a job, and he's really stepped up and played really well. the thing that coaches have been most, I think, pleased with about him is just his attitude and his demeanor, the fact that he's become a vocal guy. He's been that loud guy out on the practice field, and certainly when you're going through these long preseason practices, you need that guy. OU's had that with Eric Stryker the past few years. They had it with a couple other guys. Stephen Parker wasn't quite as boisterous as that, but still had a bit of that attitude. Will Johnson has brought that, Parnell Motley a little bit, but Justin Broyles has really grabbed a hold of that role, and I think he's got a great chance to find some playing time, if not start back there at safety, and they need it given what they're replacing with Stephen Parker and Will Johnson, both having departed.
You mentioned that we tend to forget a guy like Justin Broyles a little bit in that redshirt year, and Lincoln Riley addressed Broyles during his Wednesday availability. He made a good point that guys like him are going to be harder to forget about with this new redshirt rule, because in the future, a guy like Justin Broyles can play 4 games and still redshirt, and it'll be interesting to see how those guys who might otherwise have been on the shelf for a year will be used. Will they be used early? Will they be held on to until late in the year? I'm really curious to see how that impacts guys like Justin Broyles moving forward.
Yeah, no doubt about it. That'll be something to watch, and I think it's going to be one of those things you have to track, as who's played in how many games and who still has their redshirt status intact, who doesn't. And last year it would have benefited to Justin Broyles, who no doubt would have played middle to late in the year had that rule been intact. I think it really would have benefited guys like Charleston Rambo on the offensive side at receiver. There were some times where talking to some of the coaches over there that they were starting to think about pulling his red shirt off anyway late in the year because of some depth issues there. That's what Dennis Simmons was telling us a couple weeks ago. So that's going to be really interesting to track. But Broyles is a guy who certainly would have benefited from playing a couple games last year, but he's a guy who took it the right way, used it to his benefit that year off, and has really taken off in preseason camp this year. All
right, lastly, before we get out of here, as camp's gone on, is there a player not named Baker Mayfield who's proving most difficult to replace, a guy that's departed that you feel like has shown, wow, he had even more of an impact maybe than we thought?
Well, I think you've got to go with Obo Okoronkwo and the job he did coming off the edge. That jack position has been so good for them as far as getting pressure, and part of that lies on the issues that they've had on the defensive line that I talked about, their inability to get consistent pressure on the quarterbacks. They've needed it to come from that position. So they really need those guys like Addison Gums. They've got a couple other young guys. They've moved John Michael Terry to the outside as well. They need those guys to come through and play in a big way. But Obo Okoronkwo changed the way that their defense ran. Mike Stoops talked about this on Thursday morning. He said because of what Obo could do, you could call different things and do different things that we've really never done in this defense. And Mike Stoops said that is going to go away this year. You're not going to have that dynamic force. Now you've got to pick it up other ways. They need guys like Addison Gums and those other guys in that jack spot to be able to get some pressure, but they're also going to have to find it from the interior of that defensive line, from that other defensive end spot, and be able to figure out other ways to make quarterbacks scramble around and get to quarterbacks quickly so you're not hanging your secondary out to dry, which we've seen a lot these last few years. And it's really easy to pick that up when you're watching a game, when a cornerback gets beat or when there's some breakdown in coverage. But a lot of times it's because of what happens on the front line.
All right, lots more to go still in this preseason camp. Again, we hope to maybe hear a starting quarterback in the next few days. We'll have that news as soon as it breaks. So be sure to stay with the best coverage team anywhere at newsok.com and every day in the Oklahoman.